I don't believe in love, Alexander Hayes said quietly, staring at the woman across the bar, but I do believe in contracts. The rain outside fell in steady sheets against the tall glass windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and white, and inside the dimly lit Manhattan bar, the low hum of jazz and clinking glasses wrapped around the moment like a secret waiting to be told. Clara Bennett froze mid-wipe, the damp cloth still in her hand as she looked up at him, really looked at him this time, not just another well-dressed customer killing time with expensive whiskey, but a man whose presence seemed to bend the air around him, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for him alone, his dark hair still slightly damp from the storm, his expression unreadable except for something faintly fractured behind his eyes. She let out a small, disbelieving breath, glancing toward the nearly empty bar as if someone might jump out and explain this was a joke, but no one did, and when she looked back at him, he hadn't moved, hadn't smiled, hadn't softened. That's not funny, she said, her voice steady but cautious, setting the glass down with more care than necessary. Alexander reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and placed a folded document on the counter between them, the paper thick, deliberate, real. It's not supposed to be, he replied, his tone even, almost clinical, as if he were discussing a business deal instead of a life-altering proposition. Clara hesitated, her fingers hovering just above the paper before pulling back slightly, her instincts tightening in her chest, warning her this was the kind of moment that didn't come without consequences. You don't even know me, she said, searching his face for any hint of sarcasm, any crack in the armor. I know enough, he answered, his gaze finally meeting hers fully, steady and direct in a way that made it hard to look away. You show up on time. You work double shifts. You don't flirt for tips. And you haven't once tried to impress me. Clara blinked, caught off guard, her heart giving a small, unexpected thud against her ribs. So that qualifies me for, what? Exactly, she asked, crossing her arms slightly, trying to regain control of the conversation, of herself. Alexander exhaled slowly, leaning back just enough to create space between them, but not enough to break the tension. A solution, he said. For both of us. Outside, a taxi splashed through a puddle, the sound sharp against the glass, and for a moment, Clara's mind flickered to her own reality, the overdue rent notice sitting on her kitchen counter, the voicemail from her landlord she hadn't had the courage to return, the quiet, suffocating weight of starting over with nothing but late shifts and fading hope. She swallowed, forcing her attention back to him. Let's say I'm even listening, she said carefully. What kind of solution are we talking about? Alexander didn't hesitate. Marriage, he said, the word landing between them with a quiet finality. Clara let out a short laugh, shaking her head as she turned away, grabbing another glass just to give her hands something to do. You're serious, she muttered under her breath, more to herself than to him. Completely, he replied. A legal marriage. Public. Convincing. 1 year. Her movement slowed, then stopped entirely as the words settled in. 1 year. Public. Convincing. She turned back to him slowly, her expression no longer amused, but searching, cautious, alert. And after that, she asked. We go our separate ways, he said simply. No obligations. No expectations. Clara studied him, really studied him now, noticing the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once, just once, against the edge of the bar before going still again, the barely there flicker of something that looked like exhaustion hiding beneath his composure. Why me? She asked again, softer this time, not defensive, but genuinely confused. Alexander's gaze shifted briefly to the rain outside before returning to her. Because you're not part of my world, he said. And I need someone who isn't. The answer didn't comfort her the way he might have intended. If anything, it made the entire situation feel even more unreal, like she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't quite see the bottom of. And what? Do I get out of this? She asked, her voice steadier now, grounded in the one thing she understood, survival. Alexander didn't miss a beat. Your debt's cleared, he said. A place to live. Financial security for the duration of the contract. Clara's breath caught, just slightly, just enough for him to notice. All of it? She pressed, almost afraid to hear the answer. All of it, he confirmed. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not empty, filled with the quiet collision of logic and instinct, risk and desperation. Clara glanced down at the document again, the crisp edges, the neat lines of text visible even from a distance, and for a moment, she imagined what it would feel like to not be constantly counting dollars, to not dread every knock on the door, to not feel like one missed shift could unravel everything. Then she looked back at him, at the man offering her an escape that didn't feel like freedom so much as a carefully constructed cage. There have to be rules, she said finally. Alexander nodded once, as if he had been waiting for that. There are, he said. We don't fall in love. The words hung in the air, simple, absolute, impossible. Clara let out a quiet breath, a mixture of disbelief and something else she couldn't quite name. That sounds like the one rule people break the fastest, she said. For the first time, something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like one. Not if you don't believe in it, he replied. And in that moment, as the rain continued to fall and the city moved on just outside the glass, Clara realized this wasn't just a contract he was offering her. It was a man who had already decided love was no longer an option, and for reasons she didn't yet understand, he was inviting her into that emptiness. Clara did not sleep that night, and it was not because of the noise of the city or the thin walls of her small apartment, it was because every time she closed her eyes she saw the contract sitting on the bar between them, crisp and impossible, and heard his voice again, calm and certain, as if he had already calculated every outcome except the one where she said no. The next morning, the sunlight slipped weakly through the narrow window, catching the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen counter, each envelope a quiet reminder that reality did not pause just because something unusual had happened the night before. She stood there for a long moment in her oversized sweater, coffee growing cold in her hand, staring at the numbers as if they might rearrange themselves into something manageable, something hopeful, but they did not. Rent overdue. Utilities past due. A final notice printed in bold across the top of one envelope that she had not opened yet because she already knew what it would say. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against her temple, trying to steady the rush of thoughts colliding in her head. It is just a contract, she told herself. People sign contracts every day. Jobs, leases, agreements that bind them to something they do not fully trust because they need what is on the other side of it. But this was not a job, not exactly, and the difference sat heavy in her chest. By the time she stepped outside, the air carried that crisp early morning chill that made everything feel sharper, more real, and as she walked the familiar 3 blocks toward the subway, she found herself noticing details she usually ignored, the cracked pavement, the flicker of a streetlight that had not been fixed, the way people moved quickly past each other without looking, each one carrying their own version of urgency. At the station, she paused near the turnstile, her hand tightening around her phone as she stared at the screen, his number still there, saved without a name, just a sequence of digits that now felt like a decision waiting to be made. She could ignore it. She could go to work, pick up another double shift, pretend none of this had happened, and in a few weeks, when the landlord finally followed through on his warning, she would pack what little she had and start over somewhere smaller, somewhere harder. Or she could call him. The thought alone made her stomach twist, not because she did not understand what he was offering, but because she understood it too well. It was control disguised as help, structure wrapped around something deeply personal, and she had spent too long rebuilding her life after trusting the wrong person to step into something like that lightly. Still, the memory of his eyes lingered, not cold, not cruel, but tired in a way that did not match the rest of him, as if the rules he had built around himself were the only thing holding him together. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again with a quiet resolve, pressing the call button before she could talk herself out of it. The line rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, clear and steady. Alexander Hayes. There was no surprise in his tone, no hesitation, as if he had expected this moment. Clara swallowed, suddenly aware of how real this was becoming. "It is Clara," she said, her voice softer than she intended but firm enough to hold. A brief pause followed, not awkward, just measured. "I was wondering when you would call," he replied. She let out a small breath, half a laugh that did not quite reach amusement. "That sounds confident," she said. "It is not confidence," he answered. "It is probability." That almost made her smile, but the weight of what she was about to say held it back. "If I agree," she began, choosing her words carefully as she stepped aside to let someone rush past her, "this is not going to be one of those situations where I find out halfway through that there are hidden terms." His response came without delay. "Everything is in the contract." Clara glanced down at her shoes, worn at the edges, grounding herself in something familiar. "And the rule about not falling in love," she added, quieter now. "That is not something you can enforce." There was a subtle shift in his tone, not defensive, but certain. "It is not about enforcement," he said. "It is about understanding the purpose." She closed her eyes again briefly, letting the words settle. Purpose. Transaction. Boundaries. It all made sense in theory, clean and contained, but life had never worked that way for her. "I have conditions," she said finally, straightening slightly as if the act itself gave her more control. Another pause, this one almost approving. "I expected you would," he replied. "Say them." Clara took a breath, steady and deliberate. "I do not pretend to be someone I am not," she said. "No fake personality, no changing who I am to fit your world." "Agreed," he said immediately. "Second, this does not become a way for you to control where I go or who I see outside of public appearances." "Also agreed." She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before continuing. "And when this ends, it actually ends. No extensions, no complications." This time, his pause was slightly longer, not uncertain, but thoughtful. "1 year," he said. "And then we walk away." Clara opened her eyes, staring ahead as the train roared into the station, wind rushing past her, loud and disorienting, and for a moment it felt like everything in her life had narrowed down to this single point, this decision balanced between fear and necessity. "Then I will do it," she said, the words leaving her before she could soften them. Silence followed, not empty, but shifting, as if something had just been set into motion that neither of them could fully control. "Good," Alexander said quietly, and for the first time, there was something almost human in the word, something that sounded less like a transaction and more like relief. Clara tightened her grip on her phone as she stepped onto the train, the doors closing behind her with a decisive click, sealing the moment in place. She had just agreed to marry a man she barely knew, a man who did not believe in love, under rules that were meant to keep everything simple and contained. But as the train pulled away and the city blurred past the window, she could not shake the feeling that nothing about this was going to stay simple for long. The courthouse at 2:07 in the morning did not feel like a place where lives were supposed to change, yet Clara stood there anyway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as the hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow over the empty hallway, the kind of light that made everything feel more real than it should be. She had never imagined this moment would look like this, no white dress, no music, no familiar faces, just a quiet government building that smelled faintly of paper and polished floors, and a man standing a few feet away from her, already composed, already certain, as if this was just another step in a plan he had set in motion long before she ever entered the picture. Alexander Hayes did not look like someone about to get married, he looked like someone finalizing a deal, his posture straight, his expression calm, his attention focused on the folder in his hands as he reviewed the documents one last time, as if even now he was making sure there were no variables left unaccounted for. Clara shifted her weight slightly, the sound of her shoes echoing softly in the quiet space, and for a brief second she wondered what it would feel like to walk out, to turn around and leave this entire situation behind before it became something permanent, something that could not be undone with a simple conversation. But then she thought about the envelope on her kitchen counter, about the life she had been holding together piece by piece, and she stayed. You are early, Alexander said without looking up, his voice steady, almost routine, as if punctuality was just another expectation he had already assigned to her. Clara let out a small breath, glancing at the clock on the wall. I did not think this was something you show up late to, she replied, her tone light but edged with something real beneath it. That earned a faint shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but close enough to acknowledge her presence beyond the agreement they were about to sign. Fair point, he said, finally meeting her gaze, and for a moment there was a flicker of something softer there, something that made him seem less like a man built entirely of control. A door opened down the hall, and an older clerk stepped out, adjusting her glasses as she looked at them with a practiced neutrality, the kind that came from seeing too many stories pass through these walls to react to any of them anymore. You are here for the late filing, she said, more statement than question. Alexander nodded once. We are, he replied, his voice returning to that composed, measured tone that seemed to anchor everything around him. The clerk gestured for them to follow, and Clara moved forward, each step feeling both deliberate and unreal at the same time, like she was watching herself from a distance, walking into something she had agreed to but had not fully processed yet. Inside the small office, the desk was already prepared, papers neatly arranged, a pen placed precisely in the center as if waiting for them to complete the final step. Clara's eyes drifted to the documents, scanning the lines of legal language that now represented her future for the next year, every clause clear, every condition defined, everything structured in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Alexander stepped beside her, close enough that she could sense the quiet steadiness in him, the way he seemed completely unaffected by the weight of the moment. If you have any last questions, now is the time, he said, his voice lower now, not rushed, not pressured, just factual. Clara glanced at him, searching his face one more time, looking for doubt, hesitation, anything that might make this feel less final, but there was none. Instead, there was that same calm certainty, the same quiet distance that had drawn her in and unsettled her all at once. No hidden terms, she said softly, more a reminder than a question. None, he replied. And when this ends, she began, her voice trailing slightly. It ends, he finished for her, the words firm, unambiguous. Clara nodded slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the paper, grounding herself in the physical reality of what she was about to do. The clerk cleared her throat gently, a subtle signal that time was moving forward whether they were ready or not. Whenever you are ready, she said, sliding the pen slightly closer. Clara picked it up, the weight of it surprisingly solid in her hand, and for a brief second everything around her seemed to quiet, the hum of the lights, the distant city noise, even her own thoughts narrowing down to this single action. She signed her name, the ink flowing smoothly across the page, each letter a step further into something unknown but chosen. When she finished, she set the pen down carefully, her heart steady but aware, like she had just crossed a line she could not uncross. Alexander took the pen next, his movements precise, controlled, and without hesitation he added his signature beneath hers, sealing the agreement with the same calm certainty he had carried from the beginning. The clerk gathered the documents, stamping them with a practiced motion that echoed softly in the room, official, final, done. Congratulations, she said, her tone polite but distant, already moving on to the next task in her mind. Clara let out a quiet breath she did not realize she had been holding, her gaze shifting to Alexander as the reality settled in. They were married. Not in the way she had once imagined, not with promises whispered or emotions shared, but in a way that was defined, structured, and undeniably real. Alexander met her eyes, and for a moment the space between them felt different, not closer, not warmer, but changed in a way that could not be undone. We should go, he said, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful. Clara nodded, following him out of the office and back into the quiet hallway, the world outside waiting exactly as it had been before, unchanged and yet somehow entirely different. As they stepped into the cool early morning air, the city just beginning to stir awake, Clara pulled her coat tighter around herself, her mind still catching up to the reality she had just stepped into. She had signed a contract, yes, but standing there beside a man who did not believe in love and now legally bound to him, she could not ignore the quiet, persistent feeling that this was not just a simple agreement, it was the beginning of something far more complicated than either of them had planned. The elevator ride to the penthouse was silent except for the soft hum of the cables and the faint chime of passing floors, each number lighting up in quiet succession as Clara stood beside Alexander, her reflection staring back at her in the mirrored walls, unfamiliar in the context of everything that had just happened, her simple coat and worn boots looking almost out of place next to his composed, tailored presence. Neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the shift between what they had been and what they now were had not fully settled yet, and words felt too small to define it. When the doors finally opened, the space beyond them unfolded in a way that made Clara pause without meaning to, the penthouse stretching wide and open with floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the early morning skyline, the city glowing softly as the first light of dawn began to rise, everything polished, deliberate, untouched by the kind of chaos she was used to navigating. She stepped inside slowly, her footsteps quiet against the smooth floor, her eyes moving from the sleek furniture to the distant horizon visible through the glass, taking in the kind of space that did not just suggest wealth but control, every detail placed with intention, every surface clean, precise, almost too perfect. "You can leave your things anywhere for now," Alexander said, setting his keys down on a narrow console table near the entrance, his tone casual but measured, as if this transition was simply another step in a process he had already mapped out. Clara let out a small breath, adjusting her grip on the strap of her bag. "Anywhere," she repeated softly, glancing around again as if trying to understand where "anywhere" could possibly be in a place like this. He noticed the hesitation, though he did not comment on it directly. "You will have your own room," he added, walking further into the space, his movements familiar, effortless, as if the environment itself responded to him. "There are separate areas." That was part of the agreement. Clara nodded, following him at a slight distance, her attention shifting from the view to the layout of the penthouse as he guided her down a hallway lined with minimalistic artwork, each piece subtle but clearly expensive, the kind of detail she would not have noticed before but now could not ignore. He stopped at a door and opened it, stepping aside to let her look inside first. The room was larger than her entire apartment, bright but calm, with a neatly made bed, a desk positioned near the window, and a closet that looked like it had never been used. For a moment, Clara did not step in, she just stood there, taking it in, the quiet contrast between where she had been living and where she was now settling, pressing gently against her chest. "It is temporary," she reminded herself under her breath, more for her own clarity than anything else. Alexander heard it anyway. "Everything about this is temporary," he said, not unkindly, just factual. She finally stepped into the room, setting her bag down on the edge of the bed, the fabric looking out of place against the clean lines of the space. "You really do not waste time, do you?" she said, turning back to him with a faint, tired smile. He leaned slightly against the doorframe, his expression unreadable but not distant. "Efficiency avoids complications," he replied. Clara let out a quiet breath, nodding once as she absorbed that. "Right," she said. "Keep it simple." There was a brief pause, not uncomfortable, but filled with the awareness that this was the beginning of something structured yet unfamiliar. "There will be a meeting later today," Alexander continued, shifting back into that composed, forward-thinking mode. "My legal team will go over public protocols, appearances, expectations. We need to establish consistency early." Clara raised an eyebrow slightly. "Consistency," she repeated. "You mean we need to look convincing?" "Yes," he said plainly. "That is the purpose." She studied him for a moment, the directness of his answer both reassuring and unsettling at the same time. "And what happens when people ask how we met?" she asked, crossing her arms lightly as she leaned against the edge of the desk. "We tell them a version that is believable," he said. "Not detailed. Not complicated. Just consistent." Clara nodded slowly, her mind already trying to keep up with the layers of performance that were about to become part of her daily life. "And we just act like this is normal," she added. "For 1 year," he confirmed. The words settled between them again, that same quiet reminder of the boundary that defined everything they were doing. Clara glanced toward the window, the city now brighter, more awake, moving forward like it always did, indifferent to the fact that her entire life had shifted in the span of a few hours. "You really believe this is going to stay?" "Simple," she said, more to herself than to him. Alexander did not answer immediately, his gaze following hers toward the skyline before returning to her. "It will stay controlled," he said finally. Clara looked back at him, catching the difference in his choice of words, and for a moment, she saw it clearly. This was not about simplicity for him, it was about control, about keeping everything within defined lines so nothing unexpected could break through. She let out a small breath, pushing off the desk as she straightened slightly. "Then I guess we better be very good at following rules," she said, her tone light but carrying a quiet awareness beneath it. Alexander's expression softened just slightly, the faintest shift that might have been approval or acknowledgement. "We will be," he said. And as Clara turned back toward the room, beginning to unpack the small pieces of her life into a space that felt too large to belong to her, she could not shake the feeling that no matter how carefully the rules had been written, no matter how controlled everything seemed, something about this arrangement was already starting to move beyond the lines they had drawn. By late afternoon, Clara found herself sitting at the far end of a long glass conference table that seemed to stretch longer than necessary, the city skyline visible behind the people seated across from her, all of them dressed in tailored suits, their posture straight, their expressions composed in a way that made it clear they were used to rooms like this, rooms where decisions were made quickly and without hesitation. She kept her hands folded lightly in her lap, her back straight, listening as Alexander's legal advisor spoke in a calm, precise tone about public expectations, media behavior, and the importance of consistency, words that sounded simple on the surface but carried layers of meaning she was only beginning to understand. "The narrative must remain aligned," the advisor said, glancing briefly at Clara before returning his attention to the documents in front of him. "You met through mutual connections, kept your relationship private, and decided to move forward quickly due to shared values." Clara resisted the urge to smile at that, the phrase shared values echoing faintly in her mind as she glanced toward Alexander, who sat at the head of the table, composed as always, his focus unwavering, as if none of this felt unusual to him at all. "And what exactly are those shared values?" she asked, her tone polite but carrying a quiet curiosity that drew a few subtle glances from the others in the room. There was a brief pause, not tense, just unexpected, before Alexander answered. "Discretion. Efficiency. Alignment," he said evenly. Clara tilted her head slightly, considering that. "That sounds more like a business merger than a relationship," she replied. A faint shift moved through the room, not quite discomfort, but awareness, as if she had stepped just slightly outside the expected script. Alexander's gaze met hers, steady, unreadable, but there was something behind it now, something that acknowledged the truth in what she had said. "In many ways, it is," he admitted. The advisor cleared his throat gently, redirecting the conversation back to structure. "Public appearances will begin this week," he continued. "There is a charity gala on Friday evening. It will be your first official appearance as a couple." Clara nodded slowly, absorbing the information, the idea of stepping into a room full of people who would be watching, evaluating, believing something that was not entirely real settling into her thoughts with a quiet weight. "And how are we supposed to act?" she asked, looking between the advisor and Alexander. "Natural," the advisor replied immediately. "Familiar, but not exaggerated. The goal is credibility, not performance." Clara let out a small breath, leaning back slightly in her chair. "So we are performing without looking like we are performing," she said. "Exactly," the advisor confirmed. She glanced at Alexander again, her expression thoughtful now, less uncertain than it had been earlier. "And what happens if someone asks something unexpected?" she asked. "Then we answer in a way that maintains the narrative," Alexander said. "Without over-explaining." Clara nodded once, her mind already beginning to map out the boundaries, the lines she would have to walk carefully to make this work. The meeting continued for another hour, details layered over details, expectations clarified, scenarios outlined, until the entire situation felt less like an abstract agreement and more like a structured reality she was stepping into piece by piece. When it finally ended, the others gathered their documents and left with quiet efficiency, leaving Clara alone with Alexander in the now silent room. She remained seated for a moment, exhaling slowly as she looked out at the city, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the buildings, everything moving forward as it always did. "You do this a lot," she said finally, her voice softer now, less guarded. "Control everything before it has a chance to get complicated." Alexander did not respond immediately, his attention on the city beyond the glass as if he was considering her words carefully before answering. "Control prevents damage," he said. Clara turned her head slightly, studying him. "Or it prevents anything real from happening," she replied. That caught his attention, his gaze shifting back to her, not defensive, not dismissive, just focused. "That is not the objective here," he said. "I know," she said quietly. "That is what makes it interesting." A brief silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but layered with something neither of them fully addressed. Clara pushed her chair back and stood, smoothing her hands lightly over her jeans, grounding herself again in something familiar. "So Friday," she said, more to confirm than to ask. "Friday," he echoed. She nodded, turning toward the door before pausing slightly, glancing back at him. "For what it is worth," she added, her tone lighter now but still sincere, "I am good under pressure." A faint shift crossed his expression, subtle but real. "I do not doubt that," he replied. Clara gave a small nod, then stepped out of the room, the sound of the door closing behind her soft but final. As she walked down the hallway, the weight of what was coming settled more clearly into place, the gala, the people, the expectations, all of it building toward a moment where everything they had agreed on would be tested in a way that could not be fully controlled. And for the first time since she had signed the contract, Clara felt something different beneath the uncertainty, not fear, not hesitation, but a quiet sense of readiness, as if somewhere between the rules and the reality, she had started to find her footing in a world that was never meant to be hers, yet was now undeniably part of her life. Friday night arrived with a quiet kind of intensity that Clara could feel long before she stepped out of the car, the city alive with light and movement as the sleek black sedan pulled to a smooth stop in front of the grand entrance of the hotel, its glass facade reflecting the flash of cameras already waiting outside, a line of photographers positioned behind velvet ropes, their attention sharp, expectant, ready to capture every detail. Clara sat still for a brief moment, her hand resting lightly against the door handle, her reflection faintly visible in the tinted window, almost unrecognizable in the soft glow of the interior lights. The dress she wore was elegant without being overwhelming, a deep, understated shade that moved with her rather than against her, chosen not to draw attention but to hold it once it was there. She had never worn anything like it before, never stood on the edge of a moment like this, where every step would be watched, interpreted, remembered. "They are here earlier than expected," she said quietly, more to steady herself than to comment on the obvious. Alexander, seated beside her, adjusted the cuff of his sleeve with practiced precision, his expression calm, unaffected by the scene outside as if this was simply part of his routine. "They are always early when they sense a story," he replied. Clara let out a small breath, her fingers tightening slightly before relaxing again. "And we are the story," she said. "Tonight, yes," he confirmed. There was no hesitation in his tone, no attempt to soften the reality of it. He reached for the door handle and stepped out first, the flash of cameras igniting almost immediately, bursts of white light cutting through the evening as voices called out his name, sharp and eager. Clara watched for a split second, the world outside suddenly louder, faster, more intense than anything she had experienced before. Then he turned, extending his hand toward her, not as a gesture of control, but as part of the image they had agreed to create. She placed her hand in his, steadying herself as she stepped out into the light, the air cooler than she expected, the sound of cameras rising around them like a wave. For a moment, everything felt overwhelming, the noise, the attention, the weight of eyes that did not know her but were already forming opinions. Then she remembered what she had said earlier, that she was good under pressure, and something inside her settled into place. She straightened slightly, her posture aligning with the quiet confidence she had been practicing, her grip on his hand firm but natural. "Smile," he said under his breath, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Clara tilted her head just slightly, a soft, composed expression settling on her face, not forced, not exaggerated, just enough to meet the moment without losing herself in it. Together, they moved forward, step by step, pausing just long enough for the cameras, just long enough to make the image believable, the distance between them close but not staged, familiar without being excessive. "Alexander, who is she?" one voice called out. "Is this your wife?" another followed. Clara felt the question land, but she did not react immediately, allowing the moment to pass naturally as Alexander answered. "Yes," he said simply, his tone steady, leaving no room for doubt. The words settled into the air around them, heavier than she expected, more real when spoken out loud in front of people who would accept it without question. "Wife." Clara kept her expression composed, but inside, she felt the shift again, that quiet awareness that this was no longer just something written on paper, it was something being seen, believed, absorbed by the world around them. As they reached the top of the steps, the noise faded slightly, the doors opening to reveal a different kind of atmosphere inside, warm lighting, soft music, voices layered in controlled conversation, the kind of environment where everything was polished and intentional. Clara let out a slow breath as they stepped inside, her hand still lightly resting in his before she released it naturally, not pulling away too quickly, not lingering too long. "You did well," Alexander said, his voice quieter now, more private. Clara glanced at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "So did you," she replied. He did not respond immediately, his attention shifting briefly across the room, scanning, observing, as if calculating every interaction before it happened. "Stay close," he added after a moment. "There will be introductions." Clara nodded, her gaze following his, taking in the room filled with people who belonged here, people who understood this world in a way she was only beginning to learn. But something had changed in her, something subtle but important, the uncertainty that had followed her into this arrangement no longer as overwhelming as it had been before. When the first group approached, their smiles polite, their curiosity carefully disguised, Clara did not hesitate. She stepped forward alongside Alexander, her posture steady, her voice calm as she greeted them, answering questions with just enough detail to maintain the narrative without losing control of it. The conversation flowed more easily than she expected, her natural instincts guiding her through each interaction, reading the room, adjusting her tone, finding balance between honesty and the version of the truth they had agreed to present. At one point, as laughter rose softly around them from something she had said, Clara caught a glimpse of Alexander watching her, not the way he had earlier, not assessing or calculating, but observing in a quieter, more thoughtful way. It was brief, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. And for the first time since this arrangement had begun, something shifted between them, not enough to break the rules, not enough to change the structure, but enough to suggest that beneath the control, beneath the carefully defined lines, something real had started to move, quietly, steadily, in a way neither of them had fully planned for. The evening had settled into a rhythm of polite conversations and carefully measured laughter, the kind that filled the room without ever becoming too loud, too real, and Clara had almost begun to believe she understood the pace of it, the subtle rules that guided every interaction, until the energy shifted, quiet at first, then unmistakable, like a ripple moving through still water. She noticed it in the way a few conversations paused mid-sentence, in the way glances began to redirect toward the entrance, in the way Alexander's posture changed just slightly beside her, not tense, but aware. Clara followed his line of sight, her curiosity sharpening as the doors opened again and a woman stepped inside, her presence immediate, commanding without effort, dressed in a way that did not just reflect wealth but confidence, the kind that came from knowing exactly who you were and how the world responded to you. She moved through the room with ease, acknowledging familiar faces with small nods, faint smiles, until her eyes landed on Alexander. Clara felt it before she understood it, the shift in the air between them, something unspoken but undeniable, like a conversation that had never truly ended. "Do not react," Alexander said quietly, his voice low enough that only Clara could hear, but there was something different in it now, not instruction, not control, but restraint. Clara kept her expression neutral, her posture relaxed, but inside, her attention sharpened completely. "Who is she?" Clara asked softly, not turning her head, not drawing attention. There was a brief pause, just long enough to confirm what she was already beginning to suspect. "Someone from before," he said. It was not an answer, not really, but it was enough. The woman approached them without hesitation, her gaze steady, assessing, and when she stopped in front of them, her smile was polite but edged with something sharper beneath it. "Alexander," she said, her voice smooth, familiar in a way that suggested history. "I did not expect to see you here tonight." Clara felt the words land, simple on the surface, but layered with implication. Alexander inclined his head slightly, his expression composed, controlled, but not distant. "This is a public event," he replied evenly. "Attendance is not unexpected." The woman's eyes flickered briefly toward Clara, taking her in with a glance that was quick but thorough, measuring without appearing to do so. "And you must be the surprise everyone has been talking about," she said, her tone shifting just enough to include Clara without fully acknowledging her. Clara met her gaze calmly, offering a polite smile that did not give anything away. "Clara," she said simply. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if the name itself was something to consider. "Of course," she said, though it was clear she was placing the information somewhere specific in her mind. "I am Evelyn Carter." The name settled into the space between them, and this time Clara did not need an explanation to understand its weight. She glanced briefly at Alexander, catching the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the one detail he had not fully masked. "Nice to meet you," Clara said, her tone even, her posture steady, though she could feel the shift more clearly now, the carefully controlled environment they had built starting to stretch at the edges. Evelyn's smile remained, but there was something else behind it now, something curious, almost probing. "You work quickly," she said, directing the comment toward Alexander. "Last time we spoke, you were not exactly in a position to be making long-term commitments." Clara felt the words land sharper this time, not aggressive, but deliberate, designed to reveal something without stating it outright. The room around them continued its quiet movement, but within this small circle, everything felt more focused, more precise. Alexander's response was immediate, measured. "Circumstances change," he said. Evelyn's gaze held his for a moment longer than necessary, as if testing that statement, then shifted back to Clara. "I hope you understand the environment you have stepped into," she said, her voice softer now, but not kinder. "It is not always as simple as it appears." Clara met her gaze without hesitation, something inside her settling into place, not defensive, not uncertain, but clear. "I do not think anything about this is simple," she replied. The answer seemed to register. Not as a challenge, but as something unexpected. Evelyn studied her for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging that response on some level. "Then I suppose you will adapt," she said. "People here tend to do that, or they do not last." There was a faint shift in Alexander's posture then, subtle but firm, a quiet line being drawn without words. "That will not be an issue," he said. Evelyn's attention returned to him once more, something unreadable passing through her expression before she stepped back slightly, the tension easing just enough to signal the end of the interaction. "We will see," she said lightly, though the words carried more weight than the tone suggested. With that, she turned, moving back into the crowd as smoothly as she had arrived, the ripple she had created slowly fading but not disappearing entirely. Clara let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, her gaze lingering for just a moment before returning to the present. "That was not in the briefing," she said quietly. Alexander's eyes remained on the crowd, but his focus was elsewhere now, inward, controlled but not untouched. "No," he said. "It was not." Clara studied him for a second, seeing the difference now more clearly than before, the controlled exterior still intact, but something beneath it unsettled, something connected to a past he had not shared, a past that had just stepped back into the present without warning. "That is the broken part, is it not?" she said softly, not accusing, not pushing, just stating what she could see. He did not answer immediately, and that silence was answer enough. Clara nodded slightly, her expression thoughtful, understanding settling in without needing explanation. As the music continued and the conversations resumed around them, the night moving forward as if nothing had shifted, Clara realized that the rules they had built, the structure they had relied on, had just been tested in a way that could not be fully controlled. And standing there beside him, she understood something else just as clearly: whatever this arrangement had started as, it was no longer protected from becoming something real, whether either of them was ready for that or not. The rest of the evening passed in a blur that felt controlled on the surface but fractured underneath, and Clara could sense it in the subtle shifts around her, in the way certain conversations lingered a little too long, in the way a few glances followed Alexander when he thought no one was watching, and most of all, in the way Evelyn's presence continued to exist in the room even when she was no longer standing in front of them. By the time they stepped back into the cool night air outside the hotel, the energy had changed completely, the noise of the gala replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the soft echo of footsteps on polished stone. Clara exhaled slowly, the quiet almost disorienting after the constant attention inside, her heels clicking softly as she walked beside him toward the waiting car. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not empty but heavy, filled with everything that had not been said. When the driver closed the door behind them and the car began to move, the city lights sliding past the windows in long streaks of color, Clara finally turned slightly toward him. "You did not tell me about her," she said, her voice calm but direct, not accusing, just clear. Alexander kept his gaze forward, his posture composed, but the tension in his jaw returned, subtle but unmistakable. "It was not relevant to the agreement," he replied. Clara let out a quiet breath, her fingers resting lightly against her knee as she considered that. "It felt relevant tonight," she said. The words hung between them, simple but weighted. Alexander shifted slightly, his attention finally turning toward her, not defensive, but measured, as if he was choosing each response carefully. "Evelyn was part of my past," he said. "That is all." Clara held his gaze, not satisfied, but not surprised either. "She did not seem like just a past," she replied. "She seemed like something unfinished." That landed differently, and for a brief moment, the composure he held so firmly showed a crack, small but real. He looked away again, the city lights reflecting faintly in his eyes. "It ended," he said. "That is what matters." Clara studied him. Seeing more clearly now what he had tried to keep contained, not just control, but distance, the kind that came from something that had not ended cleanly, something that had left a mark he did not intend to revisit. "And the part where she said you were not in a position to make commitments," Clara continued, her tone still steady, still grounded, "that is also not relevant?" Alexander did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched just long enough to confirm the truth behind the question. "It is not something that affects this arrangement," he said finally. Clara nodded slowly, though the answer did not settle the way he might have expected. "That depends on what this arrangement actually is," she said. The car slowed as they reached a red light, the glow of it casting a soft red hue across the interior, and for a moment, everything felt paused, suspended between what had been agreed upon and what was starting to shift. "It is exactly what we defined," Alexander replied. "A contract." Clara let out a small, almost quiet laugh, not amused, but aware. "That is what it was supposed to be," she said. But tonight did not feel like something that simple. He did not deny it this time, and that absence of denial said more than any explanation could have. The car began to move again, the city continuing around them, indifferent to the conversation unfolding inside. Clara turned her gaze toward the window, watching the lights blur together, her thoughts moving just as quickly. "I need to know something," she said after a moment, her voice softer now but more deliberate. "If this is about control for you, about keeping things structured so nothing can go wrong, then where does that leave me when something from your past shows up and does not follow your rules?" Alexander's response came slower this time, not because he did not have an answer, but because the question itself required something he was not used to giving. "It does not change your position," he said. Clara turned back to him, her expression steady, but her eyes sharper now. "That is not what I asked," she said. The car fell quiet again, the space between them no longer neutral, but charged with a kind of honesty that had not existed before. Alexander exhaled slowly, the controlled rhythm of his composure shifting just enough to show that this was not part of his plan. "It means I handle it," he said. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, though the answer did not fully settle the unease that had begun to form. "You always handle everything," she said. "That does not mean it stays contained." When they arrived at the penthouse, the building quiet and still at that hour, the transition from the public world back into private space felt sharper than before, the silence inside almost too clean after everything that had just unfolded. Clara stepped out of her heels near the entrance, setting them aside with a small, deliberate motion, grounding herself again in something real, something familiar. Alexander moved further into the space, loosening his tie slightly, the first visible sign that the control he maintained outside was beginning to ease, even if only slightly. "Tonight was a success," he said, his voice returning to something more neutral, more structured. Clara looked at him, a faint, thoughtful expression crossing her face. "If success means no one questioned the story, then yes," she said. "But that is not the only thing that happened." He did not respond immediately, and that silence felt different now, not distant, but aware. Clara turned toward her room, pausing briefly at the doorway as she looked back at him one last time. "You said control prevents damage," she said quietly. "I think it also hides it." The words lingered in the air after she disappeared into her room, the door closing softly behind her. Alexander remained where he was, the city lights reflecting across the glass behind him, his reflection faint but present, and for the first time since this arrangement had begun, the structure he had built so carefully did not feel as solid as it had before, because something unpredictable had entered it, something he could not define with rules or contain with distance, and whether he admitted it or not, Clara was no longer just part of the contract, she was part of the complication he had tried so hard to avoid. The morning light came slowly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, softer than the sharp glow of the city at night, and for the first time since everything had begun, the penthouse felt quieter in a different way, not empty, but waiting. Clara stood near the window in the kitchen, a mug of coffee warming her hands, her reflection faint in the glass as she looked out over the skyline, the memory of the night before still fresh, still unresolved. She had not slept much, not because of the space, but because something had shifted, something she could not ignore anymore. Behind her, she heard the quiet sound of footsteps, steady, familiar now, and she did not need to turn to know it was him. "You are up early," Alexander said, his voice lower than usual, less formal, as if the morning stripped away some of the structure he relied on. Clara took a small sip of her coffee before answering. "Could not sleep," she replied simply. There was a pause, not awkward, but thoughtful, as if both of them were deciding whether to return to the version of themselves that made everything easier. "Neither could I," he admitted. That was new, and it caught her attention more than she expected. She turned slightly, leaning back against the counter, studying him in the softer light of the morning, without the formality of a suit, without the weight of an audience. "That makes two of us," she said. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching between them, but it felt different now, less like distance and more like space that could be filled if they allowed it. Clara set her mug down carefully, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge as she chose her words. "We should talk about last night," she said. Alexander did not move immediately, but his focus sharpened, the way it always did when something required his attention. "There is nothing to discuss," he replied at first, almost automatically. Clara shook her head slightly, not dismissive, but firm. "There is," she said. "Because this is not just about a contract anymore, and pretending it is does not make it true." That landed, and this time he did not deflect it. He exhaled slowly, the controlled rhythm of his Composure shifting again, just enough to show that this conversation was not one he could manage the same way as everything else. Evelyn and I were engaged, he said finally, the words direct, unfiltered. Clara held his gaze, waiting, giving him the space to continue without pushing. She left, he added, his tone steady but quieter now, less guarded. Not just me. She left with someone I trusted. It was not personal. It was strategic. Clara felt the weight of that, not just the words, but what they carried beneath them, the reason behind the rules, the distance, the need for control. That is why you do not believe in love, she said softly. It was not a question. Alexander did not deny it. It is why I do not rely on it, he corrected. Clara nodded slowly, understanding more now than she had before, the structure he had built no longer just a system, but a shield. And this, she said, gesturing lightly between them, was supposed to be safe because it was not real. He met her eyes, and for a moment, the certainty that had defined him from the beginning was not as solid as it had been. It was supposed to be controlled, he said. Clara let out a small breath, a faint smile touching her lips, not amused, but aware. You keep saying that, she said. But control does not mean something cannot become real. It just means you are not ready when it does. The words settled between them, quiet but undeniable. Alexander looked at her differently now, not assessing, not calculating, but seeing, really seeing, and that shift was subtle but unmistakable. And what do you think this is becoming, he asked, his voice quieter than before, not defensive, but honest in a way it had not been. Clara hesitated for just a second, not because she did not know, but because saying it would change something. Something neither of us planned, she said. There was no hesitation in her voice, just clarity. Alexander held her gaze, and for a moment, everything else fell away, the rules, the structure, the carefully defined boundaries that had started this arrangement, all of it replaced by something simpler and far more uncertain. He took a step closer, not closing the distance completely, but enough to shift the space between them. The contract can be ended, he said. Clara blinked slightly, not expecting that, her expression shifting just enough to reveal it. Ended, she repeated. He nodded once. We agreed it would be 1 year, he said. But agreements can change. Clara studied him, the words echoing in her mind, not as a solution, but as a turning point. And what happens after that, she asked. This time, he did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice carried something different, something that had not been there before. That depends on what you want, he said. Clara felt that, the shift from control to choice, from structure to something far less predictable. She looked at him for a long moment, the city stretching out behind him, the morning light catching in the glass, and for the first time since all of this had begun, the future did not feel like something written in a contract, but something open, undefined. She took a small step forward, closing the distance just slightly, her expression steady, her voice calm. Then maybe we stop pretending this is simple, she said. And see what happens when it is real. The words hung in the air, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just honest. Alexander held her gaze, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in him shifted, the control still there, the structure still present, but no longer the only thing guiding him. He reached out, not as part of a performance, not for an image, but simply, and when Clara placed her hand in his, it felt different than it had that first night, not a step into an agreement, but a step into something neither of them had fully understood yet. Outside, the city continued to move, unchanged, but inside that quiet space, something had been rewritten, not with signatures or rules, but with a choice, one that did not come with guarantees or certainty, but with something far more powerful, the willingness to try.